Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to YIVO. I'm Leah Falk, the programs coordinator. And welcome to Personal History, Searching for the Past in Home Movies with authors Glenn Kurtz and Dani Shapiro, who are sitting right over here, and our moderator, Roberta Newman. Tonight's event is co-presented by YIVO and the Museum of the City of New York, and this event is part of the programming related to Letters to Afar, which is an exhibition on view at the Museum of the City of New York through the end of March. So if you haven't caught it yet, please, we really recommend that you head uptown and see it before it goes. We'd like to thank our colleagues at MCNY, specifically Susan Jones, the director, and Fran Rosenfeld, the public programs curator, for this exciting partnership. If you don't already know, Letters to Afar is a video art installation based on home movies in YIVO's archival collection, taken by New York City Jewish immigrants who traveled back to visit Poland during the interwar period, the 20s and 30s. In tonight's program, we'll explore some of the issues raised by this exhibition and examine these films from the perspectives of the children or grandchildren of the filmmakers. If you enjoy yourself tonight, please consider becoming a YIVO member. You can pick up a membership form at the table to my right. We're also seeking volunteers, so if you're interested in volunteering, you can see me after the program, or you can visit our website. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Glenn Kurtz is the author of 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film. His first book, Practicing, A Musician's Return to Music, received enthusiastic reviews in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Kurtz also hosts Conversations on Practice, a discussion series about the writing process and the writer's life. Guests have included Jennifer Egan, Patti Smith, Adam Gopnik, Daniel Mendelsohn, and Francine Prose. He has taught at Stanford University and New York University. Dani Shapiro is the best-selling author of the memoirs Devotion and Slow Motion, and 5 novels including Black and White and Family History. Her fiction and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and other publications, and have been broadcast on This American Life. She's taught in the writing programs at Columbia, NYU, the New School, Wesleyan, and currently teaches private workshops internationally. Her newest book is Still Writing, The Pleasures and Perils of a Creative Life. And just to note, we have Glenn Kurtz's 3 Minutes in Poland and Dani Shapiro's Devotion for sale after the program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Roberta Newman. Roberta is Director of Digital Initiatives for YIVO. From 1988 to 1992, she was the curator of YIVO's photo and film archive, and she has worn many other hats at YIVO besides that. She's also the author with Alice Nachimovsky of Dear Mendel, Dear Razel, Yiddish Letter Manuals from Russia and America, published last year by Indiana University Press. So please welcome Robbie Newman. I'm sorry. Change of order. Please welcome Dani Shapiro, who will give a brief presentation.
I was relaxing there. I thought Robbie was going to speak to us. Good evening, everyone. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you this brief clip from this footage that my grandfather and my great-grandfather took in Horodok, the shtetl that my great-grandfather emigrated from. My grandfather was born in this country. And I want to tell you a little bit about the background and how I initially came across it. And it has a bit to do with the YIVO Institute, so it's really wonderfully full circle for me to be here tonight. My Aunt Shirley, who was my father's younger sister and who in many ways was the, I think in every family there's the holder of the family history in some way, and this was my Aunt Shirley. She donated the footage from my grandfather and my great-grandfather's trip to YIVO. And then I'm not sure exactly of the dates, but I think around the late 70s or 1980, the beginning of the 80s, a documentary film was made called Image Before My Eyes about shtetl life in Poland. And when the filmmakers were beginning to put together Image Before My Eyes, they put a notice in the paper looking for any kind of footage and about shtetl life in Poland, and eventually came to discover this footage. And as a freshman in college, I remember distinctly sitting at the Paris cinema by myself one afternoon and watching this documentary film, Image Before My Eyes, and seeing my grandfather, who died when I was 9 months old, who I never knew, and my great-grandfather visiting this village, and most affectingly to me, saying Kaddish at the foot of my great-great-grandfather's grave. And then the crushing realization that didn't come immediately. I mean, I've seen the film any number of times, that grave, of course, no longer exists and hasn't existed for a long time. And so the film, in many ways, became like my great-great-grandfather's tombstone, the only tombstone that is left. So that was very moving to me. Then when I was in college at Sarah Lawrence and then in graduate school, I had a mentor, a literary mentor, a writer by the name of Jerome Badanis, who wrote one of the really beautiful Holocaust memoirs called The Final Opus of Leon Solomon. Jerry befriended me, he gave me an award, he took me to lunch, we were getting to know each other, and something came up about this film, Image Before My Eyes, and suddenly Jerry looked at me and he said, "The Shapiro footage, you're the Shapiro footage." And it turned out that he was the writer of the film. So there was that sort of extraordinary coincidence. And then lastly, sometime within the last year or so, I received an email from an elderly man named Moshe Baran. And he was from Horodok. He was born in 1919. And he's, I would imagine, probably one of the very few survivors from Horodok, and very possibly the last living one. And he was looking up information about Horodok. He has a website. He's very technologically savvy, elderly gentleman. And he came across an interview of me, or perhaps he came across the clip of from the film that my husband had put up on YouTube. And he got in touch with me and told me the story. He remembered as a boy my grandfather and my great-grandfather coming to his village. He remembered the school being let out for the day. It was a big deal, these Americans coming. And my grandfather and you'll see him in a moment in the film that I'm going to play you, but he was a self-made man. He became extremely successful. He was one of the founders of Lincoln Square Synagogue. He was a philanthropist. And what isn't in the film, but came through in a lot of the stories that I've heard, is that my grandfather and great-grandfather went to the rabbi in the village and gave a dowry for every young woman in the village, including non-Jewish women, so that there would never be a sense of it having been only for the Jewish women and creating problems. Moshe Baran showed the film Image Before My Eyes to his family one day, and his kids looked in the background at a point in the film and said, "Dad, that looks exactly like you." And it was his father. His father as a relatively young man, and his father perished in the Holocaust, and it is the only image of his father that his family has. And so this connection that he felt to me was that my grandfather and great-grandfather were responsible for the single image of his father that remains. And And it may sound like a tenuous bond, but it actually felt like a very powerful one. And I think in the ways that these films often create among those of us who survive and subsequent generations. The one other thing I'll say about the film before I play it is that you'll notice that there's an aspect of it that actually appears very staged in a way. There's a sense of almost an understanding of the theatricality of the moment, of the big dealness of the moment, that here is this American father and son coming back to the village. And there were places where it seemed, and you could see it in a longer clip of the film, that they rehearsed these things a couple of times, and that people were very aware, as they often were, but very aware of being filmed. All right. The very dapper gentleman who will appear, I don't know, maybe about 30 seconds into this, is my grandfather, and the older, also dapper gentleman who's with him is my great-grandfather.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. Also, like to thank Leah Falk and Helena Gindi and YIVO for having us tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here. I'm Glenn Kurtz. And somewhat in contrast to Dani, whose family obviously recognized the historical importance of this footage quite early in the 1970s, my family had a home movie that sat in the closet for 70 years. It was something that we knew that we had, I suppose, but it was something that we continued to think of as just Grandma and Grandpa's vacation. I think, again, in contrast to Dani's family, the significance of going back to this town was for my grandparents somewhat different. Whereas I think you have almost half an hour of footage, and it was clearly something where the town played a large role in the family's life. In my family, I'm not sure that that was really the case. And I know from the evidence of the film that the trip was something where the visit to the town in Poland was much more of a side trip. It was an add-on to the trip. So let me just tell you briefly the story. In 2009, hunting around in my parents' closet, I found this film. And this was the title sequence that was added by the Kodak company. It says, "Our trip to Holland, Belgium, Poland, Switzerland, France, and England, 1938. Everything that I knew about the film was contained in that title sequence. Here you have my grandmother and 3 of their traveling companions, showing you how exciting it was to cross the ocean. Everything that I knew about the film was contained in that title sequence, but simply seeing the words Poland and 1938 together in a film was something that immediately caught my attention and made me curious about the film. If you look at there are 14 minutes of footage altogether, and to the great extent, it looks just like everybody's home movie of their vacation, the same things that you'd see on YouTube or on Facebook today. There they were in Holland, here they are in Belgium, Switzerland, in the south of France, and of course in Paris, doing what you do in Paris. There was nothing about the majority of the film that distinguished it as being other than a fairly run-of-the-mill vacation film. The footage that was somehow sandwiched in the middle between a visit to Belgium and the views of the Swiss Alps was somewhat different, and that was what caught my attention. I don't think this was rehearsed. But still, you see that the arrival of Americans creates tremendous commotion. One of the most remarkable things about the footage is that more than half of it is in color. Well, you see, there are some generic similarities, I think, to films of this era, particularly in these small towns in Poland. But when I found this film, it was precisely, I guess, the generic quality of it that bothered me the most. One of the extraordinary things about film is that it captures only specifics. It captures particular people on a particular day in a particular place. But if we don't know who those people are, or what day it is, or what that place is, then the film becomes something profoundly general. It becomes pre-war Jewish life. And it's very easy, if you don't know anything about the film that you're looking at, to sort of class it in this very, very generic way as, you know, sort of the happy people in the shtetl before the war. For a variety of reasons, that was the thing that sort of made me most determined to try and understand what it was that we were looking at. I wanted to try and understand with the greatest possible detail what precisely we were seeing. Not pre-war Jewish life, but particular people in a particular place on a particular day. I never met my grandfather, however. My grandmother, who lived into her 90s and whose coincidentally yahrzeit it is today, never talked about the trip and never about her life in Poland before coming to the United States. Nevertheless, when I asked my father and aunt, they were both completely certain that this showed my grandmother's hometown. Ultimately, I was able to find a survivor from my grandmother's hometown, show him the film, and he was immediately quite certain that he'd never seen this place before, that it wasn't his town. This intrigued me, and I figured, well, if it's not my grandmother's hometown, it must be my grandfather's hometown, but I was unable to find a survivor who was able to talk to me. I found one woman who had been born in this town, but she was so young when the war started and remained so traumatized by her experience that she was unable even really to look at the film. She would look at it and look away. So I went into archives, much like the ones that's housed in this building, and among other places, I searched in the American Joint Distribution Committee archives and ultimately in photo and film archives around the world, until ultimately I found the photograph here on the right. This was labeled in the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Western Galilee in Israel, the synagogue doors in Nasielsk, Poland. And you can see in the upper left panel of the door, there's a carved lion, which appears exactly in the other image, which is a still from my grandfather's film. It was this image that allowed me to determine with precision that it was my grandfather's hometown of Nasielsk, Poland, about 35 miles northwest of Warsaw. Well, having found the name of the town, the problem then became, how do you go from faces in a film to names? I was able to collect a large amount of documentation about the life of the town, particularly the Landsmannschaft from America, which was sending money to people in the town, and the people in the town who had organized to receive it and distribute it. But there was no way to go from the images in the film to the names in the information that I'd collected. Part of the problem, obviously, was that of the 3,000 or so Jews who had lived in this town in 1938, fewer than 100 survived the war. And of that 100, that was in 1945. I began my search in 2009. 2.5 years after I began my search, I had donated the film to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. They had restored the film and digitized it, and I received an email out of the blue from a woman in Detroit. She had seen the film online, and as the camera panned across the crowd, she recognized her grandfather as a 13-year-old boy. And he's still alive. He just celebrated his 90th birthday in November. And this gentleman, Mr. Maurice Chandler, born Moshek Tuchhandler, appears for less than a second in the panorama that my grandfather shot in black and white. But this man who survived the war with fake papers, it had been as if he'd been waiting his entire life to talk about the people in the town. He was able to identify numerous people, to remember, of course, the names of many people who were important to his life and his family, but who didn't appear in the film. And from this source, from these names, I was able finally to reach out into the documentation, as well into Jewish genealogical circles, as well as the other research and archives around the world. And ultimately, I found 7 survivors still living. I was able to interview all of them and to gather their stories and the identifications that they were able to provide of the people in the film. Ultimately, also finding a photograph album stuffed away farther into the same closet where the film was originally located, I was able to identify the precise day on which my grandparents visited. So the final thing that I'd like to do, just is to give you a little example of the kind of detail that it became possible to learn about the nature of this film. I have a brief clip of one of my many, many, many interviews with Mr. Chandler talking about the film.
Okay, here are these two people.
And we have better pictures of them coming up
Yes, yes.
the man with the white beard.
Yeah, the man with the white beard, I think he was sort of the, what they called the ascetic person. His name, everybody knew him by one name. His name was Cheskia. Cheskia is a biblical from the Tanakh. Nobody knew what he lived of. But he was dressed just like that, with that beard, and everybody fed him. He would walk into everybody's house. I remember he used to eat chopped liver with strong onions, and you knew he was coming before. Black bread, this and that, very simple life. And everybody thought he was, the Jewish version of sainthood.
Like a mystic?
Heskia. He would go from different houses, like the Bornsteins, when we used to be there. He would come up and he told stories from the past and so on, and then he'd leave. Nobody knew where he slept, probably in the shul or something. He was that type of a character. Now, the shorter men,
With the black beard.
yeah, his name is Chamnusen Zweighaft, and he was the one they called him the Matzaiva Kritzer. He was the one that chiseled all the headstones for the cemetery.
So that's just a few minutes of many hours of Mr. Chandler talking about the film, and just one of the 7 survivors I was able to locate. When my grandparents returned on September 5th, 1938, I think that they had no idea the significance of what they had done. I think to them, this was their grand tour of Europe, and the visit to my grandfather's hometown was really something that they did more or less out of curiosity, rather than in a more formal sense of going to see the family left behind. And nevertheless, because of that film, a community of more than 100 people who together hold the memory of this town was brought together, including these 7 survivors, families of survivors who are no longer living, and then, of course, people who were relatives of people who did not survive, but who hold the memory both of this town and of the people who are in the film. All of that's in my book. I think maybe we should move on to conversation. Thank you.
So it's always a pleasure to see these films. I should say that there's about, I think by my count, less than 100 of these kinds of home movies of Jewish communities in Eastern Europe from before the war. Some of them are of big cities, like Warsaw and Vilna, and some of them are of smaller places like Stettlach towns and even sometimes smaller villages. And we have about 50 of them here at YIVO, so you have a rather large collection. But I think that these 2 films are remarkable in different ways. In a sense, what Glenn says about his 3 minutes of film from his family is, it does, in many ways, it resembles a lot of the films that we have. We're excited. People from the town are rushing into the streets because Americans are there with a movie camera, and it's all, kind of shot kind of jerkily, and you see the outsides of buildings. You can't really see much of interiors because they simply didn't have enough lights to film indoors with the cameras of the day, the 8mm and 16mm cameras. But what's remarkable about this film now is that it is the most investigated of all these home movies that we have because of the work Glenn did on his book, his incredibly meticulously researched book, which reads like a detective story, really, with the first sketchy clue being this film. And Dani's film is an interesting blend of being, in a way, a generic shtetl film, in that there are many emblematic kind of scenes in it which make it very attractive to filmmakers. People carrying water buckets on their shoulders in the street, marketplaces. In some ways, footage that kind of conforms to our expectations of what Jewish life was like back then. But on the other hand, every film really is specific and is really about something, and not just, in a large poetic sense, a shtetl. So in Dani's film, there are amazing things. You don't see anything like that distribution of they look like bagels, but they're probably some other kind of roll to school kids. It's people dispensing charity. And that circle dance around the older couple. Those are remarkable things that really kind of drive home the fact that every film is a unique document. So I wanted to sort of follow through on that, and also on something that I read in your book, Glenn, where you really maintain a kind of tension between how much this film was a gateway into the past, and yet how much it was really still such a fragment of what life in Nasielsk for the Jewish community. What don't we see in the film that you learned about, and what didn't you understand about the film you're looking at until you learned more?
There's a lot to answer to that. I'm reminded of a line from Gertrude Stein who said, "Newspapers are real life with the life left out." And film, I think, is real life with the life left out. We think that we're seeing real life, but what we're seeing is a very, very small excerpt from it. And one of the great dangers that we face, and one of the motivations for me in writing the book in the first place, was this strange inversion that takes place and that we're living through at this moment. I thought when I found the film, it's still possible that we could know what we're looking at in this film. And in 10 years, in 15 years, it will no longer be possible for us to know what we're looking at in most of these home movies. And so I was motivated tremendously by this sense of urgency to learn what's outside the frame. And so when I look at the film, I see what's in it, and when I tried to investigate what's in it, every time there was a sign, I tried to read it. Maybe that would lead me to the name of someone, that would lead me someplace else. Every time there was anything that was identifiable in any way, I tried to follow it as a clue. When Mr. Chandler looks at the film, he sees the life that he lived. And what he looks at, strangely, is probably not the images per se, but what they remind him of, which is everything that took place outside the film, everything that took place before, for the 14 years that he was alive before the film, and for the 2 years, or a year really, that the town continued to exist after the film was taken. So, what happens to us when we don't know what we're looking at, we get so excited that the film exists at all. We think how wonderful, there are these 3 minutes of film, and we forget that what this tiny fragment shows us is 3 minutes of one day in a community that existed for 300 years. And everything that is not in the film is what we should be remembering when we look at the film. And instead, what we look at is just, oh, how great, the woman shakes her finger, and that's funny. Which is wonderful, it's great that we have it. I don't mean to diminish that at all. But I would never have known these two gentlemen that I played this clip of Mr. Chandler identifying, and Hamnussen Zweikaft, the Metziva Kritzer, turned out to be a fairly famous guy in the town. And so when I went to other survivors and I showed the film to them, I was able to share something that each of them had remembered and help them remember more that they didn't even know they remembered. So for example, when I showed the film to the only survivor, I believe, who's still living in Israel, a man named Michael Koprak, he also recognized Hamnussen Zweikaft, and he remembered a story that Mr. Chandler didn't know. The Hamnussen's workshop was right next door to the yeshiva, and when the boys came out of school at the end of the day, they would go and annoy him and pester him, as boys do. And Hamnussen, in order to get rid of them, this is Mr. Koprak remembering, would threaten and to send the angel of death after them. And what Mr. Koprak said was, well, this was a very effective threat because we figured, considering his profession, he's got a good connection to the angel of death. It was detail like that, the kind of lived detail that it was possible to learn that film will never tell you, but that you can only get when you try and make the connection.
One of the things I was so amazed by, Glenn, with your book, which I just think is such an incredible achievement, is that you did not approach this as an investigative journalist. Like you have no background as an investigative journalist. You're a musician and a literary writer, and to have been able to dig in that way with the passion to find everything that you possibly could of this lost world in those 3 minutes is so extraordinary. And I also just want to say that it reads, there's so much effort that went into the researching of this book, but it reads like a detective novel. Usually when investigative journalists go halfway around the world to find one detail, you can feel it when you're reading a book because it feels like, well, why is that detail in there? Because I went around halfway around the world, it's got to be in there. But your research just felt so completely seamless, and the stories, like you researched it so deeply that the stories rose to the surface and the characters became very human for us. And also, just in case this doesn't come up, there was, this film was almost, if you had waited a few more months to have this film archived, it wouldn't have existed at all. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was in the process of disintegrating, and the lab that
Was there a word for that? I'm trying to remember.
Well, there's different ways in which film disintegrate, but this had lost all of the chemical stabilizers in the plastic, and so the strip of the film that actually holds the images was separating from the plastic base, and yeah, it was going to become unviewable. But thank you very much for what you said. Yeah, I mean, I did have a background in research, so I had the skills, I think, coming into it to pursue it. But when I began, I had no idea it was going to lead to any of the things that it led to. And as I say, I pursued it for a couple of years in a somewhat desultory way because I wasn't able to find anything. And in the end of that time, I had written an essay in which I thought, well, it's just too late. We found this beautiful piece of evidence, and we'll never know what it shows, and that itself is, in a sense, emblematic of the moment that we live in which this history is transforming from something that can still be remembered to something that is only recorded and documented. So what happened, the story unfolded in a very organic way, I suppose, for me, just as one thing led to another. But let me ask you, did your family film play a role in any way in your sense of, who you were in your family or in your sense of your own history? Yeah,
I think my grandfather, and was it clear to all of you which man was my grandfather? The dapper one? He had kind of like, there was a mythology around him. And I'm the youngest of his 10 grandchildren, and the one, therefore, who really didn't know him at all. But there was a sense of his being a kind of larger-than-life character in a lot of ways. And I've written about him quite a bit, and about that part of my family quite a bit in an attempt to, in some way, reconstruct in a different way. In fact, I'm thinking as in listening to you, there was a piece that I wrote that was in the New Yorker a number of years ago called "The Secret Wife," about a story, an earlier marriage of my father's that had been secret, and to a woman who had died shortly after their wedding. And one of the things that I realized in starting to research that piece was everyone that I can interview who knows what happened and really be able to recreate the story to a point where it can pass New Yorker fact checker muster, they're all in their 80s. They're not going to be around for that much longer. If I want to know the story as much as I can know the story, it's now. But in terms of the film, I remember being very moved by having an additional arm reaching back visually and in this way to be able to see that part of my heritage, which had always somehow a much stronger hold on me and a much stronger pull on me than my mother's side of the family. And in large part, I think, because of the mythology. And you can almost see the mythology in that clip of film. There's a sense that the village knew they were coming, and that, you know, the red carpet was rolled out for them in some way, and that they were aware of this trip was about that, and prepared for, and the charity that was, that was made, or the gestures that were, and the money that was left, and all of that was something very thought through. So I think that for me, that there was a power in the in being able to see just that glimpse, but that far back in time.
That's a good segue to another question I was going to ask. And to frame it, I've got to say that almost without exception, the films that we do have were made by American Jews who went back in between the wars on trips to their former hometowns, mostly in Poland, a few in Lithuania. You couldn't really travel that freely in the Soviet Union, so there's basically nothing from there. And my question is, do you, both of you, think that these films are as much a portrait of American or Americanized Jews as they are of the people who lived in these towns? If the camera had been held by the inhabitants of Nasielsk and Horodok, would we have different film?
That's such an interesting question. Do you mean that in part in terms of what they chose to, what they themselves chose to film?
I think both. I mean, you pointed out that you can see a lot in just the faces of the people in the film and how they're reacting to the visitors. You learn a lot about the visitors that way, but also in terms of what they chose to film. It's always really important to look at these things to not only look at what's in front of the camera, but who's holding that camera, because things can be filmed in different ways.
Yeah, I was thinking about that quite a bit. Struck again, watching it, at the way that the camera was trained on my grandfather quite a bit. So who was holding the camera? Was my great grandfather holding the camera? Because there were places where, when they're davening at the foot of my great grandfather's grave, you see one of them and then the other of them, and it's actually the one place in the film that doesn't feel in any way that it was rehearsed. Right? It's a very quiet and private moment, and there's no posing for the camera.
Well, I noticed there was a woman in the film who was also an American visitor. Was that your grandmother or your great grandmother? Is one woman clearly American? Who's better dressed?
That's a little bit of a mystery to me, because my aunt has told me that was not, that my great grandmother did not accompany them on that trip, and my grandmother certainly didn't, because she was pregnant with my uncle. So,
but she's clearly American and not from the town. You can always tell.
Yes.
somehow, just in
But
body
I
language.
doubt that it
but
was she behind the camera. I
She
just
could have
somehow-
taken it, at that various moments when she wasn't in the frame. I think that they probably, that's my conjecture anyway, that they did switch off.
Well, one of the things that's funny about my family's film is it's a tourist film, and it's in the context of a tourist film. So there they are in Holland, playing with the children in costume, getting them to wave for the camera. And then they are in Poland, where the children are waving for the camera in costume, such as it is. So there's this opportunity in looking at that footage in context. Is there more to your family's footage of the whole trip, or just in Horodok?
I seem to remember there's some reels that are from other places as well.
I'd be curious-
Warsaw.
It'd be interesting
but,
to look,
Yeah,
to put them in
I actually
context.
don't know. Most of what I've seen is what ended up in Image Before My Eyes, and then in this half hour or so of the footage that we have. But it's also an interesting look at a kind of assimilation and
Because you can always
I mean,
recognize the Americans.
my grandfather was Orthodox, but there was this modern Orthodox way of life at that time that was so markedly different, sartorially and in every way from the people of the village, and I think that's stark and kind of interesting. I have first cousins and their children now who would actually fit right in.
Well, and I think it's the question of just sort of what the film would what it looks like because of who's filming it. I think it's clear from your film that it's family, and that this is an event that these people have come back to see particular people, because particular people are made the center of attention in the film, and people who are living in Horodok. I think that that's more unclear in my family's film. It is more, just judging from the camera work, it's more, this is what it's like here, rather than this is the person I came to see here. So I think that you can learn a great deal about the context of the filming just from looking at what's happening. As I say, you always recognize the Americans, and you can usually recognize people who are either family or in some other way important to the visit, because they're the ones who knew the Americans were coming and who wore their best clothes that day. So there's a number of people in my grandparents' film who are clearly dressed up, who are clearly honored to be receiving these guests. In the end, I wasn't able to find out who those people were in this strange contingency of history. Those were not the names that came down to me.
One thing I get the sense from in watching all the reels of the Horodok film is that actually it was a lengthy visit. It was probably more than one day that the Shapiros were visiting Horodok, whereas in the case of your family, it was really seems like it was an afternoon. Yeah. They were in and out. I'm wondering if you think that we can even look at these films objectively, knowing what we know and they don't know, the people in the film, that especially in the case of the Nasielsk film, which is really exactly a year almost before the German invasion, if there's any way we can really look at this material without that kind of pathos of the Holocaust. Does that distort what we see?
Well, it certainly informs what we see. And I think without, our knowledge of what was about to happen, then the poignance of the film might be much less. We would look at it and think, fine, it's old film of people. We wouldn't think, this is old film of people whose lives are immediately in danger. I mean, when I first looked at this film, and I think that this is a common experience, the first thing that I wanted to do was, scream at them to run, as if I could have some influence upon, because I knew what was going to happen. So, yeah, I think that our knowledge clearly informs this film, but a question that I always get asked about my grandparents is, well, it was 1938, how could they go to Europe? How could they not know? And so it's important, I think, for us to remember that there was a world in which the Holocaust was unimaginable, truly unimaginable, and that all of these people lived in it. and we don't. To us, it's impossible to imagine a world in which the Holocaust isn't possible, because we've been brought up knowing that it is. And certainly my generation, who was educated, from the earliest age into sort of Holocaust remembrance, I think it's impossible for us to look at the film and not know. But nevertheless, it's important for us to try and remember when we look at it, because these are not victims. These are people who are living their lives. And we, the questions that we ask of them, why aren't you, trying to escape? Don't you understand? These are totally anachronistic questions. Yes, there was tension. There was always tension. Yes, things were bad for the Jews. Things were always bad for the Jews. So, the context in which my grandparents went and interacted with these people is not the context in which we interact with the film. And the film, fortunately, is evidence of that.
I mean, one wonders, I wonder sometimes in this age where everything is on video, there's so much video of everything, and yet 100 years from now, will that be just as fragmentary? Look at the year 2015, let's say, as that seems to us. Now there's going to be more footage if it survives.
That's the question, though. Right? Probably it'll be even more fragmentary, because almost nothing of our video, of our digital imagery will survive. The lifespan of a digital image is about 10 years. My grandparents' film sat in the closet for 70 years, untouched. And then, of course, the technology to play it was still available and viable, whereas, I have discs from less than 10 years ago that I can't even play anymore. The data may even still be intact, but the data is inaccessible because the software and the hardware no longer exist to show it. So and even with the cloud, the vast majority of our documentation that we think is so, significant is going to disappear.
Yes, there's such a field as digital preservation. For instance, people may not know that, and also that actually in the archival world, it's still considered that if you digitize something, it's not actually preserving it. As a matter of fact, many people now in archives, you sometimes will digitize a whole collection and then go get that microfilmed. Because the microfilms now are really great, and they think they'll last like 500 years, but no one's too sure about digital images. So when it's true, we may be videoing like crazy now, there may be nothing left. Let's hope that they figure it all out, and some of it will be there. So,
well, there's also an ephemeral quality to so much communication now. You think? I'm thinking of my 15-year-old son, and his mode of communication now with his friends is Snapchatting, where the photograph instantly disappears, just gone.
But maybe that's a little bit like going back to the telephone, where you talk to somebody. And that's the end of that, where teenagers used to communicate, like spend hours on the phone.
Well, and I think it's worth noting that when my grandparents shot this film and when they came home, there was no reason to believe that it was a significant film, right? Its significance is not in what it captured, it's in what happened in the world around it that caused this ephemeral visit, this very touristic visit, to turn into something of historical value.
And I think in the case of my grandfather and great-grandfather, there wasn't a sense of the historic importance of it. It was more a little bit of the importance of the work that they were doing there, and a little bit of a sense of, again, the kind of the mythologizing of the family. Why is this important? Because we're doing it. Whereas, of course, it became something more than that.
Were you aware at some point in your growing up in recognizing that the nature of this film had changed from being something that was just documenting the good work of your family or simply the town where they were from into something that also had historical value representing a world?
I think I understood that pretty much as soon as I saw the film. When did I see the film? The early 80s. It was clear what it was in that context. And of course, that feeling and that realization has deepened as I've grown older and understood more just about the nature of time and memory and the way that, and I had no idea that there were only 100 films of these.
There might not even be 100.
That's
I mean,
amazing.
it's just, I know we have 50 here. There are a few in other places. I would say less than 100 is accurate. There are a couple of other, there are a couple of about 3 films that are what I would call Landsmannschaft films, which is that there actually were commissioned films, not shot by an amateur, but shot by professional cameramen who were hired by representatives of Landsmannschaft. And does everyone know what a Landsmannschaft is? It's a hometown association, which raised money for the hometowns back in Poland, and then sent somebody actually to give it out. And there were at least 2 or 3 of those trips that were documented, and then they came and they edited a little film together with intertitles and showed it to the Landsmannschaft. Here's what your money did, and there'd be family members appearing in the film and things like this.
But I think this is one of the things that makes home movies such an extraordinary resource for research, because even a Landsmannschaft film, which is after all a sympathetic cameraman, and it's a sympathetic generally portrayal of the community, it nevertheless has a political agenda. So on some level, it's going to show the poorest people, to evoke the sense of need, because they're showing this at fundraising in the United States, fundraising events. And then also they're going to show the good works. Oh, you see, here we are providing, this is what your money is doing for these poor people. So there's a goal and a political goal to some extent. This is obviously also true of newsreels of the images and of the towns, as well as any other kind of professional
There's hardly
film.
any newsreels of these places, maybe none. Of Warsaw, certainly, in big places, but never of any of the small places. There is some fragments of newsreels from Munkacs in the Carpathians, which was sort of passing back and forth between Czechoslovakia and Hungary in the period, because the Munkacs Rebbe's daughter was getting married. And thousands of Hasidim were coming to the town, and it was considered newsworthy by some Fox movie tone stringer who was floating around there. And so we have actually little bits and pieces of that. And then just the other day on Tablet, there was a article about how they finally dug out of the vault some footage of a convention of Agudas Yisrael, the religious party, and I forget where it was, in Geneva or someplace like this. And the Chofetz Chaim, the famous rabbi, the Chofetz Chaim, was induced to attend this. So suddenly there's footage of this legendary religious figure that no one had ever seen. So there might be still bits and pieces. There might even still be films like this in people's attics and closets. And they should get them to some place like us or the Holocaust Museum, so that they, in case they're decaying, that we might be able to still rescue them. So I'm going to open up the proceedings to questions from the audience. And Lee, I don't know if we need a mic or okay, so run around the mic.
About the Shapiro film, your family went back to Poland. They were very Americanized. How long had they been in the United States before they went there to become that Americanized? And what year was the film filmed?
Yeah, the film was 1920.
I see different things about your family film all over the internet, including that it was filmed by David Shapiro. Is that your...
David Shapiro's my great-grandfather.
Okay, so then it's not inaccurate. But I thought I've seen 1931 and 1933. So
around then.
Do you have any documentation about that trip? Anything? We'll talk later.
Okay. My Aunt Shirley probably does. My grandfather was born here, and his father would have come in the late 1800s. Not even the very late 1800s, probably 1880.
1880s.
Something like
maybe?
that, yeah. So they were very Americanized, and that whole, 3 out of 4 of my grandparents were born here. But my grandfather on my father's side married my grandmother, who was from Richmond, Virginia, and from like about as old and southern a Jewish family as you could. So it was very, no. So there was this, I mean, I've been fascinated by that part of my family for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they were Orthodox, but they lived this this life of going out and going to clubs and going on European travel and living a very glamorous and very American, very, very assimilated life. Whereas my Aunt Shirley, the daughter of that marriage, has 65 great-grandchildren now. She had 4 children, and between those 4 children, among them 65 great-grandchildren. And quite a number of them are Haredi and living in, in settlements, and they're all Orthodox in a way that is no longer an assimilated modern Orthodox life. So it's just like fascinating to me, and something that really captures my imagination in a lot of ways in terms of wanting to really understand and trace that journey.
What does a synagogue look like? What does a school look like? What does the interior of a house look like? That didn't appear, and I wondered, did you research, for example, what does the synagogue look like? What does the school look like? Did they refrain from taking those photos? Because you would have expected as tourists they might want to include that.
Right. Well, there's a long sequence in which people exit from the synagogue, and you can see the synagogue doors there. The footage altogether is unusual in that there are several interior scenes, which is somewhat rare for home movies at that time because the film itself wasn't responsive enough typically to film indoors. And you could see it was very dark. My grandfather didn't know how to compensate for that with the camera. But no, you're absolutely right. In the Alps, of course, it's clear my grandfather was very impressed by the glaciers because it's the longest panorama of anything in the film except for the children in Nasielsk. So he spends as much time as he can filming these mountains and almost the same amount of time filming all the children in Nasielsk. He doesn't film the synagogue as just a building. Here's the synagogue, or the school. Here's the school. So these were clearly not the things that he thought were important to document. He does focus primarily on the people. In the course of my research, naturally, first thing is I needed to try and identify the buildings to try and figure out where they were. I was able to identify the synagogue. That does no longer exist, was torn down right after the war. But I learned a great deal about it from people who had been inside. And the school is an interesting situation. Again, I don't believe that it appears in the film, but it became a very significant location precisely because the people who I'm interviewing now were all kids at the time. So they remembered that was an important venue for them. And it happens that the school building that was the yeshiva at the time is now the public high school in Nasielsk, in the town. And this past October, approximately 50 members of this community of people who were associated with the town went back with me to the town, and we met with the high school students in this building. So we know now what's in that building, but it was not what was attracting my grandfather's eye. He was clearly, when he picked up the camera, he was filming people in Nasielsk.
I should say that if you, a lot of these films, I was very surprised. Often the camera, whoever's behind the cameras also films the churches of the town, which I thought was, I could never quite understand it, but I guess it was, these were landmarks. They remembered the church, and it was a way of identifying, this is my town. So there's a surprising lot of Jewish home movies with churches.
What you just spoke about, your visit back with the 50 people, can you talk a little bit about that? That sounds fascinating. The reaction of the students, what was their connection? Was this something that was just another thing that, that you had to learn about, or did they actually connect it to their lives in any way?
Yeah, I realized when the book was about to come out that 2014 was the 75th anniversary of the deportation from this town. It took place because of its proximity to Warsaw, it was occupied by the German army within days of the invasion. By September 4th, 1939, this town was in German hands. And the entire Jewish population was deported on December 3rd, 1939. So 75 years later is 2014, just this past December. So I had originally talked with Mr. Chandler about maybe we would go back together. In the end, he didn't make that trip, but then I opened it out to his family, and they opened it out to their... In the end, it ended up being an enormous group of 50 people. And when I realized that it was going to be so large, I thought two things. First, we have to do things there that are more than just walk around town. And also, we represent something for this community. We're not just going there to commemorate. This is not just the purpose of the trip is not just mourning, but also we hold a memory of the town that the town itself remains ambivalent about. So it was important to me to try and meet with as many different communities within the town as possible in order simply to open up a dialogue between people, survivors who were born there and grew up there and identify as being from this town, as well as, the children and grandchildren who consider themselves, their ancestry from this town. So yeah, we met with high school students under the auspices of an organization called the Forum for Dialogue Among Nations, which is a Polish educational organization which goes into high schools and has the students research the Jewish history of their town. This group was in there last spring, and I had arranged Skype conferences with them and Mr. Chandler. And we met with those students and had, several hours of conversation about what they had learned, what they knew about the history of their own town. And of course, they had lots of questions for us about what does it mean to us to come back and to be there again. It was an extraordinary visit. We were greeted by the mayor. It was a large group, so the reception that we received was really quite astonishingly warm. But there's a big generational change, let's say, that's taking place at this moment in Poland. Whereas I think our instinctive response is that the Poles are terrible and they don't understand and they never. That may be true of the parents, of the grandparents, certainly of the great-grandparents' generation, but the kids now, 15-year-olds whom we met, 16-year-olds, same age as your son, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, they know what's going on in the world in a way that their parents don't and never did and aren't interested in, typically. So I left with a degree of hope that it's possible that the connections between these two communities, which are traditionally antagonistic, might yet have some development.
Well, from your answer, I guess what I was going to ask really isn't so relevant, but in doing research on the towns of my two grandparents, for example, it was the younger generation of people that I met who learned a lot about the Jewish residents from their father or grandfather, and was able to convey memories of Christians of their Jewish friends, and to learn more of perspective from there rather than here, or from survivors. So you didn't mention that, but I just thought that if any of the school children that you met were able to find out things locally.
Well, that's really fascinating, and I think you're extremely fortunate. And I think it is possible. Every town differs, and the relations between the Polish and the Jewish residents of the town probably differed. And of course, at this point, we're basically up to who happens to still be alive, or who conveyed these stories to their families and had them passed down. So I think it is possible that the Polish population in small towns where there is no longer a Jewish community might still hold a lot of information for us trying to learn about those communities. It takes the real effort of going there and speaking to people and overcoming a sense of suspicion on both sides to listening to their stories. But you're very fortunate.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll sell some books.
question about, the sense of urgency now to, like, I just want to go into a closet and just start going through the closet and finding if there anything in there. While my father, who's, got dementia, can still perhaps explain something to me. So I'm wondering, how does the organization here work with either the synagogues or the federations or whatever to kind of get the word out? Like, really, does anybody have any footage of some of these small towns in Europe? Is there a way of communicating and trying to gather some work? I can't believe there's only 100 of them,
Yeah, I don't, who knows if there are any more, or, I think people do have some, people, I think, have more of a sense of historical, consciousness about these things than they used to, just because of there are a whole lot of programs about family history and who am I, whatever those shows are, on PBS, I think. But it doesn't mean that there still aren't things sitting, in closets. There have been efforts, organized efforts, to interview people. Mostly they come through things like the Shoah Visual History Foundation, where a concentrated effort with a lot of funding was put into, by Steven Spielberg, was put into getting Holocaust testimonies. And every now and then there's a project where a call is made that people are looking, for things, and that's how actually these films that we have at YIVO, almost all of them were initially collected because the filmmakers of Image Before My Eyes put notices in Jewish newspapers saying that they were looking for these things. And then over the years, more have come. People saw the film then, and they said, "Oh, wait, I've got a home movie." So it's it would be great, if people were out there. I think they are, but in the framework of smaller projects. And the door is always open here for donations of films, photographs, family letters. We're still actively collecting, and we make them available to researchers. And we've digitized, thanks to a grant from the Steven Spielberg Righteous Persons Foundation, we did take most of these home movies and digitize them, and some of them are online now too.
I would imagine too that even though it would seem in a certain way that there would be lots and lots of these films, that it was a very specific subset of person and of family that would have had the means, would have been in this country long enough to have had the means, and would have been in possession of an early motion picture camera. That's like a very, very specific kind of, and then would want to leave the Alps and go to the village, or in the case of my grandfather, make a pilgrimage like that in particular.
Mm-hmm. And then of that subset, the families have to preserve the film and not just throw it out when the grandparent dies, because who wants grandma and grandpa's vacation videos sitting around? What are we going to do with them is the fairly typical question. And then of that subset, that third subset, the film itself has to survive, has to be in reasonably good shape. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I just wanted to say that I encountered so frequently in my research was people who had historically valuable artifacts in their possession, but who felt that they were such precious family objects, they didn't want to let go of them, or they didn't think of them in a context beyond the family. Yes, we have all of these pictures that grandma and grandpa took when they went back to Poland, and they're so important to us, of our family, that they're just us and our family. Who else would care? And it was astonishing to many of the people that I met, first of all, that anybody else cared, and second of all, that not only did someone care, but that these photographs might contain unique instances of someone else's life that were historical. And just like the story that Dani told about this gentleman in Israel who saw his father I guess the grandfather in the film. This happened frequently where someone would give me a photograph, well, this is my grandmother and 3 other people, and I don't know who they are, and it would turn out to be the sister of one of the survivors who didn't have a photograph of his sister. It was the first time he'd seen the photograph of her since he left in 1939. So I think we have to also overcome our own sort of closet of thinking that these just belong to the family, that they're also historically important documents that become more valuable when shared.
I think that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you all so much for coming, and I'm riveted, and I want to read everything both of you have written now. So please feel free to stick around. I'm sure both Dani and Glenn are willing to sign copies of their books, and have a good evening. Thanks.